I now welcome the first speaker on side opposition tonight. Tom Harwood is a new figure on the Westminster scene as a journalist for the infamous Guido blog. Already he is gathering a reputation as an influential figure on the right. Be careful in listening to his floor speech tonight, as it soon could be government policy. Tom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that infamous introduction, and thank you for inviting me back here to the Cambridge Union tonight. They say you only ever come to the Cambridge Union 2 times in your life, once on your way up and once on your way down. So it's great to be back here this evening discussing a very important subject. The last time I was here, we were talking about something that was perhaps slightly more immediate to students' lives, that of tuition fees. I was arguing the potentially less popular side of the debate that evening amongst this demographic, and yet we managed to win the day. So hopefully I see an analogy with that debate here tonight. On the face of it, this is perhaps a less popular proposition to be arguing. But when we explore the detail of it, I'm sure that you will all come on side. That's the hope anyway. So, reading the motion, at first glance it sounds perfectly reasonable that Western intervention, the sort of Western intervention that we've heard about for the last 2 decades, consistently through the media, it seems that the West has been a dreadful force. We have seen images from war zones, and they are nothing short of horrific, and it's only right to empathise with the absolute horror and devastation of war. But it's wrong to suggest that if the West were to lay back, sit back and do nothing, that devastation would not exist. The proposition here tonight is that there are no easy options. There are no situations whereby we can put our hands up and watch the world blossom. The world isn't like that. We don't have easy choices. We don't have easy answers. Tonight I'm going to make the case that this proposition before us, that Western military intervention does more harm than good, is not a moderate suggestion. It's not a reasonable suggestion. And the logical conclusion of it is that it will lead to a situation whereby we will never intervene, and that could make the world a much worse place. It's not a moderate proposition. We can broadly categorize foreign policy or views around foreign policy in a contemporary setting into 3 main categories. I like to base this around the arguments over Syria under the coalition and early second Cameron ministry, where we had that initial vote in 2013 where Parliament unexpectedly defied the Prime Minister and said that we shouldn't intervene in Syria, we shouldn't attack the Assad regime. And then that seismic debate in 2015 when Parliament voted for targeted military strikes against Daesh assets in Syria. Now, the first category is those sort of people who always pursue intervention, where intervention is always the answer, where we should never hold back, where if something is wrong somewhere in the world, we should always go there. That's category 1. Category 2 is that sort of 2015 Syria category, whereby, yes, targeted strikes would be right. That vote passed, the one in 2013 didn't. That's category 2, that's sort of the middle way. And then category 3 exists in a realm whereby we would never intervene in any country abroad, whereby any use of our armed forces would be seen as wrong and dangerous and damaging. I'm arguing tonight that the proposition is laying down for you a worldview of category 3. Of never intervening, and ultimately, whether you believe that intervention is right all of the time or some of the time, then you have to agree with the opposition tonight. Personally, I'm someone who wasn't in favour of that first Syrian intervention. I'm someone who wasn't in favour of the Iraq war, who isn't always gunning for use of our armed forces abroad. But I'm someone who recognises that sometimes it's the right thing to do. And I worry that if we get into the mind space whereby you're saying that it does more harm than good, that's not applied to foreign policy in the round. In immediate discussions, that is employed to those specific cases. Yes, sir.
Thank you. What we're talking about is not whether or not we would condone military intervention. We're judging the effects of past intervention. You can perfectly consistently say, I would support some intervention in the future, and yet say that the past has been bad. So I don't see the relevance of your point to the motion.
Well, I thank you. I thank you for your intervention, because that brings us on to point 2. That is that it's not reasonable to quantify the damage done by military intervention. All foreign military intervention causes horror, destruction, lives lost, lives ruined, absolute carnage. This is not pretty material to be talking about. And yet, who are we to say that one particular military intervention abroad has caused more harm and more devastation and more destruction than another? Indeed, who are we to say that what time period we're talking about? Are we going back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Are we including the Second World War in this entire discussion, which I argue would be a particular weight on this side of the argument? No, I think it would be wrong to try and weigh up mathematically, like a formula, this kind of idea. It would be wrong to say that there is this war that counts for this much bloodshed and that much, and we should sort of tot it up as if these are statistics and not human lives. Ultimately, what we have to recognise is the arguments that will be made off the back of this decision tonight. And so the argument here is that you can think that Iraq was a mistake. You can think that Vietnam was wrong. And you can oppose this motion tonight. That is not an inconsistent position to hold, in my view. We can look at the successful military intervention. We can look at Kosovo. We can look at Sierra Leone. We can look at those strikes against Daesh. We can look at the times where we chose to step back and perhaps where genocide could have been avoided if we didn't so often agree with motions like that tonight. Ultimately, we have to keep our minds open to the idea that military intervention can be something that can be a force for good in the world. And you can never generalize. You can never do that in that mathematical sense. So yes, it would lead to no use of our armed forces at all. Ultimately, if we are going to say that it does more harm than good, then why on earth would we keep an army? It sounds silly, but ultimately this is the position that Jeremy Corbyn has been arguing for and laid down in that 2015 Syria vote. That is the position that 150 members of parliament voted for in 2015, saying that we shouldn't deliver targeted airstrikes against specific Daesh assets in Syria. That is a mindset that is profoundly damaging, not only because this is a country that ultimately, yes, it makes mistakes, but it is a force for good in the world. If we retreat from the global scene, what steps into the vacuum? We've seen it in the Middle East, unfortunately, in the last few years. The swell of the influence of the Russian regime. And actually, we can come to the point on Saudi Arabia through that. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is not one that is born out of Western military intervention. It's one that is born out of diplomacy. And if we're going to take the route that we never intervene, that we argue that this is a bad thing, that we have to only pursue dialogue, that is when we will create a dozen more situations whereby we are talking to and enabling the kind of regimes like Saudi Arabia. It's right to take a stronger line against a country like Iran. We should not be pursuing the similar sort of relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia with a country like Iran. There are some systems in the world that deliver abject misery for the people that live under them. And yes, it's not always right to militarily intervene in those countries. Of course it's not. But it's right to make sure that we do not fight with a hand behind our back, that we do not say that we will never intervene, because ultimately there have been too many situations in the past where we have this pendulum effect, whereby we intervene and perhaps it goes wrong, and that means that we don't intervene the next time, and that could mean even greater devastation. Ultimately, this argument is not an easy one. It's to say there are no easy answers. It's to say that ultimately we have to keep all the options on the table, and to vote with the proposition tonight, you would be taking them off the table and potentially be causing much more harm in this world. That's our case tonight, and I hope you will vote against this dangerous proposition. Thank you.